Hello everyone and welcome to this course on Defensive Technique for Beginners by Chess University. My name is Ryan Murphy and I am a USCF expert level player with several years of coaching experience. One of the main problems I notice in my beginner level students is that when they are faced with threats, they tend to not see the whole board and they panic when they're under attack, which causes them to make poor assumptions and to select suboptimal moves. I've designed this training course to help improve your thought process and calculation habits when it comes to meeting your opponent's tactical threats and positional ideas, but the emphasis is on concrete tactical threats. In this course, I'm focusing on three general types of defense, namely reaction, prevention or prophylaxis, and counterattack. Within the discussion of each technique, I will repeatedly stress the importance of choosing defensive resources which are multi-purpose and maximize the activity of the defender's pieces. I'm also going to emphasize the importance of accurate calculation to overcome the panic instinct that is so common at lower levels. Again, this course is designed specifically with players in the 900 to 1200 ELO range in mind, but I do believe that it'll be useful for players both above that rating range and maybe slightly below it as well. The course delves primarily into the psychology of candidate move selection and comparing evaluations of defensive options. But of course, since this is a training course, there are many opportunities for the student to calculate and answer concrete tactical questions on their own. The training possessions are carefully selected for my own tournament games, and you'll have some chances to improve on my play or that of my opponents. With the general overview complete, I'd like to show you one example from each of the three highlighted defensive techniques to give you a better picture of what to expect in this course. So I'll start with the diagram we have in front of us. This is on the topic of reaction. So this is the first category of defensive technique I'll be discussing in the second video. So in this position, I had the black pieces, and my opponent played the move pawn to a5. Now, this has a sort of larger positional idea behind it, but the first thing we should notice is that the pawn on a5 is of course hanging. So I could play the move queen take a5. And there's really not too much to think about here before taking the pawn. You maybe could calculate and try to figure out what white is up to, but white's sacrificing a pawn sort of positionally, and it turns out that it's not sound, but the idea is somewhat logical. What white is trying to do here is prevent black from playing the move a5. So in a way, their pawn sacrifice is sort of prophylactic. They want to eventually take this pawn on b4 with the knight to get the knight into play, because right now this knight is not a good piece. It's stuck on the rim, and it has actually nowhere to go. So a5 is an interesting idea, but of course black will take the pawn. Queen take a5. And now this is the first moment where white's going to make a threat, and we have to decide how to properly react to it. So white plays the move bishop to d2. And as I'll say many times in this course, the first step to stopping or correctly reacting to your opponent's threats is to identify what they are and if they're actually real. In this case, white has played bishop d2, which develops a piece. And another thing that it does is it protects the rook on a1, which before, in this position, was unprotected. So bishop d2 connects the major pieces on the first rank, defends the rook, and so now white actually has a threat. So I'll let you guys pause the video and see if you can identify what this threat is. And then we'll discuss our options as far as how we can solve the problem. Okay, so in this position, because the knight is no longer in a pin, thanks to the rook being guarded, white would very much like to follow up with knight takes b4, which would attack the queen on a5, and also bring the knight into play very quickly. And that, again, that knight was white's big problem piece. So in this position, we have to figure out how best to react to this threat. So clearly we don't want any discover attack on our queen. So we'd think, oh, we want to move our queen away because we don't want to get hit with a tempo. But it turns out that not all queen moves are going to be equally good. For example, if we go back to c7, while that gets us out of the pin, that still allows white to take this pawn. And they get exactly what they want. They have a rook on an open file. Our pawn on a7 is a little bit weak, and their pieces are very, very active. So that would be bad. Instead, if you guys saw the move queen b6, that's excellent. It's the only way to safely get out of the discovered attack and also to defend the pawn on b4. So both sides saw this when white played a5 and black took the pawn. So now white follows up with queen b3. And we have to ask the same question. What is white threatening? And throughout this course, I'm going to really drill this into your head, and it'll be very helpful, I think, in your own games. Because if you get into a habit of asking this question, what does my opponent want? What are they threatening? Whenever they make a move, you're going to give yourself a better chance of spotting nasty tactical resources that your opponent is scheming up. And this gives you the best chance of reacting accordingly. So after queen b3, there's one primary threat that we should all hopefully see. So if you noticed it, the pawn on b4 is now attacked 3 times. It is attacked by the knight, the queen, and the bishop, and it's only defended twice. So we have a queen and a bishop defending. So obviously 3 is larger than 2, so we need to defend this pawn again. So the only real safe way to do that is with a5. So this is what I played. Now there was also a secondary threat, but it had to be figured out in advance that this threat is not real, it's a ghost. And many times people get afraid of ghosts when they're trying to defend, and that causes them to overreact to something that's not actually in the position and causes them to panic and sort of self-destruct. So in this position, you might also have thought that there's this battery of the queen and the bishop pointing at the e6 pawn. So there could be some potential sacrifice, like bishop takes e6. And this was the only thing I calculated, or had to calculate, before I took this pawn back on the 10th move of the game, queen take a5. I saw the position that we got here, and that's all I had to calculate and evaluate was, is bishop takes e6 a real threat? And pretty quickly, I'll show you what I had calculated in my head. So if white had gone for this, I would have simply brought my queen back. I'm getting ready to trade queens, and if the queens get traded, the king will be totally safe. e4 is played. This is to prevent the move queen d5, which would have traded queens. Queen d7 to offer a queen trade, knight takes e4, and queen d5. And it looks kind of scary at first because black's king is in the center, but the e-file is blocked completely, the queens are about to get traded, and black is just a piece up. So I had to accurately calculate that my opponent's sacrifice does not work, but once that was achieved, it was just a question of reacting to the threats as they came. So far all of this should make sense. Knight c3 was played. Of course, the knight cannot be taken due to the pin. And probably white wants to bring the knight into a more active position, perhaps on c5 later. But in any case, that's not a threat. This is the first moment that black has not been under attack, having to react to something. So the next thing you always want to ask, after you ask the question, what is my opponent threatening? You want to ask, what do I want to do? How can I improve my position? And in later sections on the course, we'll be discussing positions where the opponent's threat isn't actually that important and your idea or your threat really is. So instead of reacting to the opponent's perceived threat, you should carry out your idea. So this is one of those cases where white doesn't really even have a concrete threat, so we can afford to either castle or move our queen out of the pin. I chose to move my queen out of the pin and then castled on the following move. So I played knight bd7, rook fc1, and then I castled. And here, again, the big question I had to ask myself is white actually threatening to take on e6? And I actually set a little trap here when I castled, which my opponent fell for. And after this, I'll conclude this example and go to the next one. But if you want, you can pause the video and try to figure out what happens after bishop takes e6, because it looks like I've blundered. It looks like after bishop take e6, fe6, queen e6, if rook goes to f7, then knight g5 would have me in a very awkward pin. And otherwise, when the queen checks on e6, it's a double attack on my bishop, which is loose, and my king. So I'll let you guys try to figure out what trap black is setting if white takes on e6. Okay, so that's in fact what happens. So we can follow the game. Bishop takes e6, f takes e6, queen takes e6 check, king h8, and my opponent fell for the trap here and took on e7. And if you saw this, really good job. After the move rook ae8, the queen actually has 0 squares and is completely trapped. And black went on to win this game. So that's an example of black just having to react to a couple of direct threats from white, and then afterwards black was able to get their king safe. White tried to complicate by going for a sacrifice, but it didn't work. So black ended up with a big material advantage. So that's the example for the introduction on reaction. The next example I would like to show you guys is going to be on the topic of preventative action or prophylaxis. So that's the example we see here on the board. I had the white pieces in this game, and my opponent played the move bishop takes c5 in this position. And I actually failed to appreciate that black has a threat here. And if I had asked myself, what is black threatening, I think I would have been able to prevent their trick, and I would have won this game without any problems at all. As it went, I only won the game because I got extremely lucky. So in this position, try to figure out what black is threatening. Okay, so in order to find somewhat hidden tactical resources, if you don't see the pattern right away, if it's not part of your pattern recognition already, you can try to break the position down into its basic parts. So looking at like where are all the pins in the position, what are all the undefended squares, where are all the checks. You can approach it in this way, and that might help you identify possible threats from the opponent. So using that method, we see the bishop, which previously was on d6, is now on c5. And on this new square, we say, okay, what is the bishop literally doing right now that it wasn't before? It's pinning this pawn on f2. So that's a new function that the bishop has. And because that pawn is pinned, that means that this square on g3 is unprotected, right? Pinned pieces don't protect. It's a well-known mantra. Okay, and what else? Then we also look at forcing moves on top of that. And we look at checks and captures. Well, I don't think bishop takes f2 is a real threat, because I can just recapture with the rook and everything's fine. Other captures, like knight takes d5, is ridiculous, because the knight will just take back, so that's nothing either. But then we look at other captures, and we see this very strange move, Rook takes h3, which is quite dangerous. At least in the sense that it leads to at least a perpetual against white's king. So I failed to appreciate this, and I played the move knight to a4, attacking the bishop, which is in a pin. And I thought my position is just fantastic here. I have two bishops, black's king is stuck in the center, or at least it's still in the center. You know, I could play rook e1 pretty soon and then try to open up the e-file. This just looks overwhelming. But it turns out that I missed a very nice tactical resource from my opponent, rook takes h3. And it's because I didn't even stop to ask, you know, what is my opponent doing? I just assumed that when they played bishop takes c5, that was like an automatic recapture. But I failed to appreciate how the position had changed. And after g takes h3, queen g3 check is the key point. And after king h1, black has a perpetual. Like this. Now my opponent tried to play for a win and ended up losing. They actually didn't take the perpetual. And they are down material, so you know there's a big risk there. But I think I didn't need to allow any of this at all. If I had just exercised prophylactic thinking and asked what does my opponent want, back in this position, I would have come up with a very natural move that stops this whole thing. So I'll give you guys a chance now to pause the video and try to find a way that prevents this tactical idea from black, this rook takes h3, queen g3 check idea. And there's probably more than one good answer, but a move I particularly like for white is bishop f3. Again, this is a multi-purpose move, and that's what I want to stress when you're defending against threats. It's totally possible to move the king to step out of the pin. Like for example, like king h1, for example, would get out of this queen g3 check. We're no longer pinned. But we're moving our king in a file that is occupied by an opponent's rook, which feels very wrong somehow. You never really want to line up your important pieces with your opponent's heavy pieces or bishops. You're just setting yourself up for tactics later. So while that would get out of the threat, it puts the king on an awkward square, and it doesn't really improve my position otherwise. It's purely a reactive move. I would like to react to the threat while also improving something in my position. So I like the move bishop f3. I improve the bishop, defend the center, I open the e-file for my rook, and I'm also sort of just interfering with my opponent's idea. Now if they were to try to go for this, the key difference is that I have this move bishop g2. And all of a sudden black is completely lost. They're just down a rook, basically. There's no attack here. My bishop defends my king perfectly. I can start giving checks on the e-file. I can start offering queen exchanges. Black's got nothing here. They're completely busted. So again, had I simply asked this question, what does my opponent want? I think I would have had a very reasonable chance of finding the simple move bishop f3, defending against the threat, and going on to hopefully win a pretty smooth game. Okay, and the final example from the introduction that I want to show is on this topic of counterattacking. So in this position I have the white pieces, and my opponent played the move knight to c4. And there's a very obvious threat here. Knight c4 attacks my bishop on b2, which is undefended. So it seems like I should probably react to this threat by moving the bishop. Normally speaking, this is what I'd like you guys to do. Instead of being fancy and looking for like ways to counterattack all the time, you do want to ask like, okay, can I move my piece some safe square or eliminate the attacker? Is that good for me? But in this position, moving the bishop doesn't feel right. For example, bishop c1 is a horrible move. It disconnects the rooks, puts the bishop on a passive square. It's going backwards in a position where white has a lead in development and should be trying to attack somehow. So bishop c1 is a reaction move, but in this position, it just feels very wrong. Similarly, like we could move the bishop here, but I mean the bishop's not really doing that well on the square either, and we haven't really continued our attack. So when my opponent played the move knight c4, I obviously saw the threat, but I was trying to ask myself, well, black's really underdeveloped. I have a lot of pieces near their king. Their king is in the center. Can I make a counter threat that's stronger than the threat of knight takes bishop? And again, I also don't want to eliminate this knight by taking, because they can take with either pawn, and I've lost my good bishop. The bishop on b2 is currently not a good bishop because it's blocked in by the pawn on e5, but the bishop on d3 was, pointing to the king side and giving hopes of an attack. So I don't like these sort of standard options of just reacting passively. I don't think these are going to give white any advantage. So in this position, of course, this took some calculation, but I found a way to create a counter threat. So if you guys would like, you can pause the video and try to find a way to create an even bigger threat than the threat that black has on our bishop. Okay, so I'll assume you guys paused the video. I played the move queen h5. I think queen f3 is similar and is also interesting, but this is quite forcing, because if black were to take on b2, which they did not in the game, they would lose, because queen takes f7 check. So this is a very forcing move. Black only has one legal move. Then knight takes pawn check, only, again, one legal move. Knight takes bishop check, again, one legal move. And then after queen takes, we'll notice that white is up material, with a really big attack also. Black's king is very weak. So that's one line I had to calculate. Now that might be difficult. Many of the people watching this course may find that their comfort zone for calculation is maybe like 2 or 3 moves ahead. But I do want to stress that the best way to become strong at defending is to become really good with your tactical patterns. And the more tactical patterns you know, the more you'll be able to see variations like this very quickly. So, of course, a big part of defense is being able to calculate. And hopefully more of the exercises in this course will help with that. So queen takes f7 is a bigger threat than black taking the bishop. But of course, we don't know that intuitively. We must check the variations first. So I had to do that. And I also had to check, and this is even more important, what happens if g6? So black is making a counter threat of their own. They're defending my threat, and they're also attacking my queen. So all of a sudden, I have a queen hanging and a bishop hanging. And this, I think, is a very common scenario when beginners are trying to go for a counterattack. They'll forget that their opponent can respond in a defensive way, which also leaves 2 of their pieces on pre. So in this position, white better have a pretty good way to continue the attack, otherwise they're going to just lose material. So here I was intending to play queen h6, and if knight takes bishop, I was going to play queen here, rook f8, and knight takes h7 when the rook is trapped, and white wins. And finally, the last piece of calculation for this counter threat queen h5 that has to be checked is the move that was played in the game, which is knight takes pawn on e5. Not going after the bishop, but simply trying to take a pawn and defend against my threat. So black asked themselves, what is white threatening? And they said, okay, threatening the check on f7, I'll defend it. And then the game continued from here, and I won an interesting attacking game. But I want to point out that this was a very critical moment after knight c4, because had I reacted by just moving my bishop away, then perhaps black would have been able to consolidate themselves on the king side and gotten a reasonable position. Okay, so I hope you guys like the introduction and have a good idea about what this course is generally about. So yes, thank you for checking in, and I'll see you guys in video number 2.